Hello, hello. Welcome to Wicked Words, the podcast where you get to listen to my terrible New England accent while I talk about true crime and other dark topics. My name is Brooke, and today is episode number 7. It's not like a fully researched case. I tried to kind of scramble and get together a short case for our first Wicked Words Wednesday episode, but it brought me down so many other rabbit holes because it's one that I can remember the ending of it playing out, but I didn't really do a whole lot of research into the original case. It has so many other outlets that I could go down and make probably like a 2-hour long video about, honestly, but I tried to stick to the main topic and present like the facts and not go down all these rabbit holes like I usually do. So I saved some interesting things that I found for the end, but without further ado, let's get into it. It was a typically frigid late December afternoon in Saxonburg, Pennsylvania. The chilly air enveloped Police Chief Gregory Adams as he approached the driver's side door of a white 1980 Mercury Cougar he had just blocked from exiting the Agway Feed Store's parking lot. "You got your paperwork?" Adams asked, the warmth of his breath creating a cloud of cold in front of him with each word. The middle-aged man handed over a New Jersey identification, stamped with the moniker Stanley J. Portis, as Adams began to explain his reason for the roadside check. "You passed me back there on Water Street and blew right by the stop sign. With school letting out..." Adams's speech was interrupted when, without a single word, the dark-haired driver produced a .22 caliber handgun, pointed it at the police chief, and fired twice. Stumbling to the ground, the wounds immediately began to bubble with blood. Adams had not been wearing his bulletproof vest that day, as it had unfortunately been lent out, a true testament to his giving nature. The Cougar's door creaked open, and heavy footsteps pounded against the pavement toward Gregory. Instinctively he drew his .38 Smith & Wesson, aiming with as much precision as he could muster before squeezing the trigger. He believed at least one of his shots had made contact, but disappointingly hadn't been fatal. The stranger snatched the pistol from Adams's hand and repeatedly whipped him in the face with it before emptying the magazine into the critically injured chief. The echo of gunshots rang out throughout the quaint and quiet town, alarming nearby residents that something was askew, even prompting some to search for the source. School buses passed by as the tires of the Mercury squealed away, leaving behind Adams, who lay on the ground grasping to life like a slippery rope. When a concerned citizen ran to his side, she barely recognized the popular police chief. He had been beaten so badly. Adams told her that he didn't know his attacker before matter-of-factly announcing he was not going to make it. He held on, though, recalling the details to his partner between cries of excruciating pain. Gordon Mainhart, the only other cop in town, rode in the back of the ambulance with Adams as the emergency vehicle sped down the icy streets. "Pray for me," Adams said to Mainhart, before losing consciousness. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Butler Hospital as a result of his injuries. Snow silently began to fall on Saxonburg, almost as though nature was attempting to hide the tragedy that happened that fateful day. Police Chief Gregory Adams was only the second homicide victim in the town's 150-year history, and the case would become the longest unsolved murder of a police officer in the United States. Gregory Blaze Adams was born on March 10, 1949, to Benjamin and Angela Adams. He was the youngest of the couple's 4 children, the only boy among 3 older girls. The family of 5 lived in Natrona Heights, where Gregory attended St. Joseph High School. After graduation, Adams joined the United States Marine Corps, setting the foundation for his future. Upon his discharge, he entered law enforcement, serving with the Washington, D.C. Police Department for a few years, deciding to transfer after a colleague had been killed in the line of duty. He joined the force of Saxonburg under the guise of safety, and it was during this time Gregory met a young woman named Marianne. It wasn't hard to figure out why Marianne fell for the military man. Adams was often described as being an extremely nice guy, always willing to help someone in need. This caring character had been paired with devilishly good looks as a bonus. Before long, the two were married, and in the late 70s, Marianne gave birth to two little boys, Benjamin and Gregory Jr. The Adams family couldn't have been happier, settled in their Thelma Drive home, nestled in safe little Saxonburg. Investigators would comb the taped-off parking lot, searching for any clue that would lead them to the assailant of this horrendous crime. Scattered among the snow, police discovered a .25 caliber Colt pistol, along with a New Jersey driver's license. Two different blood types were discovered, one matching Adams, with an unknown O-positive sample, presumably the killer's, confirming that he had been injured in the scuffle. After digging further into the driver's license, authorities determined it was fraudulent. Stanley Joseph Portis passed away in 1956 due to cardiac complications, yet this license had been issued recently. In 1980, New Jersey didn't provide photos with their paper licenses, and only required a birth certificate to obtain one. Initially, it appeared to be a blow to the investigation. However, it revealed that the name had been used as an alias by Don Webb, the current husband of Portis's widow. Donald Eugene Perkins was born on July 14, 1931, in Oklahoma City, raised by his paternal grandparents. Not much is known about his early life besides the fact that he never stayed in one spot for very long, moving all over the country, eventually settling in New England. Donald changed his last name to Webb and enlisted in the Air Force, serving out of Otis National Air Base in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It didn't take long for him to be dishonorably discharged, though, and after a string of dead-end jobs, Webb took on a career in which he'd be moderately successful: crime. Webb met a pregnant Lillian while living in New Bedford, and the pair married in 1961. The birth of Stanley completed the couple, and despite not being biologically his child, Don bestowed his surname on the baby boy. Lillian worked a legitimate job as a saleswoman for a now-defunct box company, but she was very aware of her husband's illegitimate activities, even participating at times. The Webb family dynamic was vastly different from the American dream the Adamses were living out in Pennsylvania. In fact, in late 1979, Webb was arrested in Colony, New York, with his longtime accomplice, Frank Locke, after the pair were caught burglarizing homes they had gained access to while posing as sewer and water inspectors. Webb and Locke each posted their $35,000 bails before fleeing the state. In July of 1980, there were sightings of the two men in Allentown, Pennsylvania, 300 miles away from the small township of Saxonburg, where the duo would end up by the end of the year. Although only Webb was seen in the White Mercury by witnesses on December 4th, it was suspected the plan was for Locke to meet up with him at the jewelry store they planned to steal from, before circumstances took a turn for the worse. It wasn't the first run-in with Pennsylvania police that Webb had while on the lam. Months before the murder, he had locked his keys in his car. Stressed out about the situation at hand, Webb internally panicked when a state trooper offered his assistance. There was no trouble, though, and thankful for that, Webb stopped by the station the next day to bring the officer a bottle of scotch. It wasn't the same with Adams, however. Webb couldn't talk his way out of this turmoil, and at almost 50, he had no plans on going back to prison. So he made the premeditated choice to end Police Chief Gregory Adams's life in an attempt to save his own, showcasing Webb's selfishness. A week after the small-town slaying, the fake ID was linked to a white Mercury Cougar rented from the Shea Rose dealership in Taunton, Massachusetts. However, it wasn't until the following week that this car was located. Abandoned in the parking lot of a Howard Johnson's in Warwick, Rhode Island, there wasn't much evidence to be collected, but a significant blood stain on the floor mat indicated to the FBI that Webb had been severely wounded, and they were starting to wonder if he even survived. Despite this suspicion, a nationwide manhunt in hot pursuit of the federally wanted and newly identified Donald Eugene Webb arose. Detectives immediately questioned Lillian Webb in regard to the whereabouts of her husband, but she declined having any knowledge and promptly retained the counsel of Jack Cicilline, renowned attorney of the Patriarca mob family of Providence. By spring, the only thing uncovered was Chief Adams's handgun. A father and son had stumbled across it on a farm 7 miles away from Saxonburg in Winfield, Pennsylvania. By May of 1981, the investigation stalled, and the FBI placed Webb on the 10 most wanted list in hopes of sparking public awareness. This seemed to work, resulting in anonymous tips claiming that Donald was living in the New Bedford Fall River area. It ended up being a letdown, since Webb was nowhere to be found. Surveillance attempts on Lillian were futile. She would perform evasive driving maneuvers and often change her appearance, sometimes even wearing disguises. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack, and slowly tips trickled in about men who strongly resembled Webb, spotted in Washington, Canada, and even Costa Rica. In January 1990, William Sessions, the FBI director at the time, received a letter penned by someone alleging to be Donald. The author begged for forgiveness from the Adams family and hinted at the possibility of a surrender, only if he could speak directly to John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted. After testing and handwriting analysis determined the letter was authentic, the call was scheduled for April Fool's Day. The date proved to be appropriate when it became evident the caller was playing the cops, unable to answer simple questions to identify his identity. The case remained cold until 2015, when a man was arrested in Detroit using Donald Eugene Webb's name and social security number. After digging into the matter further, it was resolved to be a straightforward case, but poorly planned, act of identity theft. With the 35th anniversary of the Adams murder approaching, the reward was increased to $100,000. Rumors ran rampant that one of the gangs Webb had been involved with ordered a hit on him as a consequence to his offense. The story even detailed Webb's burial in a Pennsylvania cemetery under a plot set to be used the next day. However, none of this could be substantiated. Regardless, in 2007, Donald Webb was removed from the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list after a 26-year-long feature. No new leads had been produced, and it was felt universally that he had more than enough exposure. It was finally time to replace his black and white photo with that of another deserving fugitive. Investigators reassured the public and the family that this action did not mean that the case was closed. The total opposite had been true. FBI agents were invigorated by the recent capture of 79-year-old James Whitey Bulger and had been subsequently reassigned, pouring their energy toward the goal of apprehending Donald Eugene Webb. An unexpected partnership formed with the task force investigating an illegal gambling scheme out of Fall River that involved no other than Stanley Webb. Together, the teams would crack the case wide open. In 1997, Lillian Webb, along with her son, purchased a 2-story ranch on secluded Maple Crest Drive in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. For 20 years, her unsuspecting neighbors would wave to the elderly woman on the rare occasion that she emerged from her home. The community was hit with a wave of shock when at sunrise on the morning of June 15, 2017, the FBI raided the 83-year-old's residence, carrying out a door, its frame, and boxes of evidence that had been seized. Soon after, an array of newly acquired photos were plastered on every news station and website. The FBI hoped seeing the color images would conjure a memory in someone and inspire them to come forward. Instead, it motivated Mary Ann Jones, the police chief's remarried widow, to file a lawsuit against Donald, Lillian, and Stanley Webb. This suit allowed the search warrant to be unsealed and provided even more details into what was discovered. A thorough search of the house had been executed, and during the raid, an agent noticed a crudely manufactured closet. Upon further examination, it was revealed that there was a secret door hidden in plain sight. This door latched inside, so someone could lock themselves in, hiding away from anyone who might come wandering. It wasn't any larger than a shower stall, and it had no electricity. A single wooden stool sat in the darkness, accompanied by a cane and a couple of boxes filled with Kennedy half-dollars. After speaking to the previous homeowners, it was learned that this room hadn't existed when they sold the property to the Webbs. And when confronted, Lillian claimed that she had it constructed in case of an emergency, but police weren't convinced. The FBI began increasing pressure on Lillian. With the looming civil trial and possible federal charges for harboring a fugitive, agents offered her immunity and provided a letter from Mrs. Jones stating that she was willing to drop the civil case in exchange for Webb's whereabouts. After lengthy consideration, Jack Cicilline contacted the Boston FBI field office to set up a conference. The group gathered in Lillian's living room, intently listening to her every word. "Where do I begin?" the frail voice inquired. "How about the day Don came back from Pennsylvania?" the agent suggested softly. Lillian recalled Donald returning to their Hawthorne Street home. His lower lip had almost been completely torn off, and his leg had a compound fracture between the ankle and knee. "He wasn't shot," she said. "The cop kicked him and shattered the bone." Lillian and an unknown accomplice dropped Don off at Toby Hospital in Wareham under an alias before cleaning and dumping the rental car off at the hotel in Rhode Island. Webb was in the hospital for 4 long weeks, yet his leg never recovered correctly, forcing him to utilize the cane when he walked. Lillian hid her husband for decades, even moving him from her home in New Bedford to the Maple Crest Drive residence. They hadn't been in the new place long before Webb suffered a severe stroke, one that left him immobile. He warned Lillian she needed to start digging a hole in the backyard for him. He knew he wasn't going to be alive much longer. After several smaller strokes, Donald finally passed on December 30th, 1999. He weighed only 100 pounds as a result of his illness, making it much easier for him to be disposed of. Lillian placed his remains into a large green Tupperware storage bin and dragged it to the 4-foot hole she created behind the shed. As a final homage, she tossed his .22 caliber handgun on top of the bin and began replacing the dirt. There, he remained for 17 years, a ghost on the East Coast. Lillian dug her heel into the hard dirt, weathered by the years, to mark the ground and signal to officers where they would find him. The mayor and present police chief of Saxonburg made the 9.5-hour trek to Massachusetts. They felt their presence was required on the day Donald Webb's skeletal remains were exhumed, parking proudly in front of the Webb property. It was a strong reminder that justice was being served for Police Chief Gregory Adams. On their return to Pennsylvania, a celebration for the town's 185th anniversary took place, and a moment of silence was held in memory of the fallen officer finally finding peace after almost 40 years of unrest. Now, it's time for my rant. It was not thoroughly researched, not as thoroughly researched of a story as I would prefer, because there were so many damn aliases used that I would probably be here for a year, doing the research. Regardless, I did find a bit of info that I thought was kind of interesting. First, let's discuss the gang ties that Donald Webb had. One of the groups that he was related to was the Patriarcha mob, and this is a topic that I have done a ton of research on, and it's definitely on my podcast idea list, but it's something that's going to end up being a way longer video because it gets into depth a lot. The Patriarcha family was run by Raymond Patriarcha, and he was mostly out of Providence. They would rob places like banks and jewelry stores and hotels, even performing shipment heists on tractor trailers, and then they would take all those goods that they stole and sell them down in Florida to other gangs usually. This is how he became involved with that group in Miami, and that was mostly through Frank Locke, his accomplice there. Jack Cicilline was the notorious mob lawyer for this family, which is so ironic because his son David ended up becoming a congressman for the state. But Rhode Island isn't a stranger to corruption by any means. The former mayor of our own capital, Providence, was Buddy Cianci, who is now a convicted felon. Oh, and he ended up getting reelected after, because people loved him so much. Massachusetts doesn't have a spotless record, though. The state police have been accused of and proven to have done a multitude of sketchy things, including overtime fraud. But in this case specifically, there was an internal affairs investigations because there was a leak of information to Lily and Donald Webb. This gave them the jump on police, where they knew that Don was being named as a suspect and he could then hide. The interesting thing is, in New Bedford, Stanley Webb was a police officer at this time. From 1981 to 1984, he was a New Bedford police officer, and he was forced to resign as a result of investigations into illegal gambling. So one of the sources that I came across was a blog by an East Providence police officer. Well, I'm guessing he's a former police officer now. And he was kind of discussing his theory about how the FBI possibly turned a blind eye to Donald Webb, just like they had done with Whitey Bulger, because there didn't seem to be a completely thorough investigation in the 1980s. Like, it wasn't until, the illegal gambling investigation that they kind of gained some traction with the Donald Webb case. And the reason for this is because it was now affecting Massachusetts' income. So, and some of the things that he brings out that, he says, like, well, if the police were investigating back in the 1980s, how could they not have looked at all the area hospitals for anyone who, maybe had a leg injury, because they knew from a witness that he had been injured in the leg. So why not look at the 3 hospitals in that immediate South Coast area and see if there was anyone admitted with injuries that matched? Because there was, they would have immediately found him if they did that. It just seems like a huge oversight. And then not to mention the phone bill in the Maple Crest Drive home. This is the home that was purchased after 17 years after the murder. It had Donald Webb's name listed as the person on the account. It just seemed that there were a lot of red flags that they didn't, look further into, I guess. I don't know. Honestly, I'm speaking from what I read, and I know that there are a lot of legal nuances that maybe they had to go cut through, write some red tape, but they had a surveillance camera pointed at her house, and they watched her pull into her garage, and she refused to get out of the vehicle until the door closed completely. And it's kind of assumed that that's how she was getting Donald different places, maybe. Lillian was what they called a true mob wife, though. They called her Diamond Lil because she would sew her stolen diamonds into the lining of her curtains. She was also known as Dakota Lil. I guess she was a singer back in the day, and she had a vinyl record that she proudly displayed on her wall. It was said that Webb and her had a really strong and loving marriage despite the troubles that came with it. She was in that lifestyle with him, and she was there for the long haul, apparently. It was after she turned on her deceased partner, though, that Lillian decided to ask about the reward money. She figured that she led police to his remains, so she should be entitled to the $100,000. And when Mrs. Jones, the police officer's widow, heard this, she said that she would have punched her in the face had she been in person, because you have to be a special kind of asshole to say something like that. And it seems that this region is just filled with them, to be honest. Speaking of, Stanley Webb, his wife, and his daughter, and her husband were all indicted in 2018 for that whole illegal gambling thing. So this scheme involved calling cards and these video game machines that were placed in stores throughout Fall River. And the funny thing is, I remember these. My brother and I used to go around the city and collect cans, and then we would go to the liquor store and turn them in for the money, and we would get candy and stuff like that. But we would always try and press the machines and try to get them to play free games, and they never would. And that is how Stanley Webb and his family got in trouble for illegal gambling, because these machines are supposed to be free, I suppose, free to play. You're not supposed to be handing cash for credits and receiving cash in return without having a gaming license through the state. So the state's not getting their cut. They came down on the Webb family, and that's when Donald's remains were found. It's assumed that he ended up making $2.1 million off of this gambling scheme, and they only recovered $500,000 of it from a hidden compartment in his Westport home. So I guess that's something he picked up from his mom. The pretrial hearing date was set for February 28th of 2020, but the world kind of like collapsed around that time because of COVID, so he's been out on bond, his own personal cognizant bond, and a new trial hasn't been scheduled as far as I could tell. I looked everywhere I could find and didn't see anything, so he's just out here chilling. Apparently, they decided that they were going to open a business in 2017, the same year that Donald's remains were uncovered, and this establishment was called the Donut Factory, and it was located in Fairhaven. It's still in Fairhaven today, and it's got like amazing reviews, honestly. It was featured on Phantom Gourmet. I'm not sure if that's just like a regional show, or if that's like a nationally syndicated thing, but the ironic part about this is that Tisha Pauline from our last episode, she worked at the Donut Factory. And then when you think about the fact that Donald Webb served out of Otis National Air Base, whatever, just like Peter Contos, it's like that reaffirms this whole idea that people from Massachusetts are just assholes. And I can say that because I am from Massachusetts, but I am not a criminal. Let me just clarify that. Frank Locke was Donald Webb's partner in crime, and he was directly tied to the Patriarch mob by marriage. He was apprehended by authorities in 1982, and he was extradited back to New York to serve his original time on top of extra time for bail jumping. He was only on parole for 3 months in 1986 before he was rearrested, but this time he served much longer. He was released in 2000. And toward the end of the FBI investigation, they had reached out to Locke, who was actually in a nursing home in Florida at the time. And even as an old man, I think that he was like 75, he refused to give any information about his friend. He was a true mobster, man. He passed away in 2017, the same year that his buddy's remains were uncovered, so that's kind of creepy. Don ripped out the microphone and a piece of paper from a notebook in Adams' cruiser, and the investigator said that had he been more concerned about the driver's license that he dropped, this case probably would have ended so much more, it probably would have never been solved ever. And they wouldn't have found his name, they wouldn't have, found Lillian, and who knows, he could have been still committing crime this day. Saxonburg was a small farming town established by a pair of German brothers, John and Friedrich Roebling, and it had a tiny population back then, but right now it's only got a small population, about 1,600. So the fact that the police chief didn't know his attacker was like a big clue to his partner that this was not somebody like known to them, which it wouldn't have been anybody in the town anyway. The only other murder that had occurred up to this point had happened in 1942, and it was a 44-year-old woman who took the life of her 2-year-old niece. I couldn't find more information about it. I really looked. There was literally one article from 1949, and it was behind a $20 paywall, so that wasn't happening. But I would have loved to get more information about it because it's just so random, and the fact that it was probably it was the first known homicide in the established years of that city, like, that's kind of crazy. The brothers, John Roebling was actually like a really well-known designer. He designed the wire suspension bridges and even inspired the Brooklyn Bridge. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this short episode. I'm working on a much longer one that delves more into a dark topic than it does like one specific case. And it's gonna, hopefully it'll be out next week. If not, I'm debating on releasing it in parts, or I may just kind of put it together as one long video and release shorter episodes like I did with this one, even though this episode it probably isn't as short as I think it's going to be. I have so many different research projects going on right now, and then I just kind of decide like which one I'm feeling, which one appeals to me most at that time, and I work with it. So, I mean, if you have any case suggestions that you want to hear, feel free to drop them below. Email me at wickedwordsyt@gmail.com. Feel free to subscribe so that you can stay with us every Wednesday for Wicked Words Wednesdays. And thank you as always. I will catch you on the flip side.